All right.
Friends, how is the volume on this? Good?
How's the volume on this?
Okay.
Good?
We'll take it down just a tad. So,
Okay.
oh, no worries. No softball questions. Okay, so friends, good to have you with us today as we continue our faith conversations. Today, I had heard some folks say, hey, you've talked about all kinds of stuff, but you've not talked about Presbyterian Church USA, which is what you guys are. So I said, okay, well, I can grab a buddy and we can end up chatting. So I have Christian Boyd here, who is the pastor at Southminster Presbyterian Church in Waukesha, but he's also the stated clerk of the Presbytery of Milwaukee. So the Presbytery of Milwaukee is the regional governing body that is bringing together of, is it 43 congregations at this point, or 42? Somewhere in there, between 40 and 45 congregations.
Technically 44 right now.
44 right now. Okay, so it's a gathering of 44 congregations that go from the Illinois border up to almost Sheboygan, and then over to Janesville and Beloit and up to Beaver Dam. So it's in that area that the congregations are gathered together to make decisions. And so Christian's job is to be the chief polity officer, the person of record for contact, and he makes the rulings on what is inside and outside the boundaries of the rules for the meeting as groups come together to have that discussion. He's also responsible for the minutes, but thankfully, as someone who was stated clerk before Christian, he doesn't have to take the minutes.
Right.
We actually have someone else who is really great at doing that. So today we'll have the same format of the conversation where I ask questions. We'll go for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have the last 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. So why don't we start off with that same question that I've been asking everyone. Tell me what you would say the main tenets that Christians in the Presbyterian Church USA believe.
Well, Christians that are part of the Presbyterian tradition or in the Presbyterian Church USA, their main essential beliefs are no different than the majority of other Christians, especially the historic. We have within our Book of Confessions the Apostles' and Nicene Creed, so that shapes the core belief. So when Presbyterians say that we are Reformed, Protestant, and Catholic, big C, it means that we are able to trace our faith all the way back to the early church and to the founding apostles. So our core faith, our baptismal faith, is no different than Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Methodist, Anglican, and such. How we live that out is different, though, culturally and by the way that we organize ourselves for mission.
So what would be some of the things that make Presbyterians different than other Christian denominations?
So there are two things that I think of that makes Presbyterians, especially Presbyterian Church USA, unique. First is our theology. As Presbyterians, we are part of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. We're part of the Reformed tradition of Christians, the people that came right after Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation. And as part of the Reformed tradition, I like to think of the Reformed tradition as more as a philosophical approach of how we do theology. And it's rooted in our concept of the sovereignty of God. So if we root ourselves in the concept of the sovereignty of God, then that means that we have to admit that we are not God. Can I get an amen on that? So if we're not God, and then that starts breaking down the ways that we create idolatries within life and the way that we do discipleship. As we live into this idea of sovereignty of God, then that also shapes how we organize for mission. And our tradition, the Reformed, starting with John Calvin and others in Switzerland and especially in France, started messing around with this new form of government which was actually not really new and influenced by the Greeks, and it was called a democratic republic. And so our polity, the way that we govern our churches and we set it up, mirrors kind of a democratic, meaning that we vote, we elect our leaders, and a republic, meaning that those that are in leadership vote their conscience as they govern the body. So and this is probably one of the reasons why I became a Presbyterian, is that the Presbyterian tradition is democratic. We elect our leaders, and anybody and everybody is invited to participate in the life and ministry of the church. And as we work together, discerning how God is moving in the world, as we are, as part of the Reformed tradition, reformed and always being reformed by the Word of God, which is Jesus Christ.
So you say that we're part, there you laid it out that we are Christian, that we are, part of the Reformed tradition, Protestant, and Catholic. So tell me a little bit more about how you make a distinction between Presbyterians and Lutherans. What are some of those distinctives? You talked about this idea of sovereignty of God, but there's probably a few more things that go into those differences.
So, and this is an interesting thing. Since the ecumenical movement started back in the 60s, and we started having conversations with other denominations and other Christians, we are finding that our core essentiality of identity is not theological, but cultural. So Lutherans, they may gear their theology like we do ours around the sovereignty of God. Lutherans do theirs around justification by grace through faith. And that's how they organize. And then culturally, they organize their church a little different. However, down at the core, at the very essence of who we are the same. And in fact, with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church USA is in full communion. So we can actually swap pastors back and forth, and we actually have joint congregations. So the distinctions are anymore really like, does your family eat pizza on Thursdays?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Usually it's on Tuesday when it's on sale at Papa Murphy's.
Right.
But,
So yeah, so Taco Tuesday is my house, and then we eat pizza on Thursday. So we have a sharedness, but it's different. So, but it's not one that we should excommunicate each other over or get into a fist fight. Maybe. I don't know. We'll find out afterwards out in the parking lot.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about those differences between, so you're saying that there's slightly different foci
Yes.
for different groups that are coming out of the Protestant Reformation.
And culture.
And culture.
Meaning that there's a carried history within that body that's forward, that has value, that they don't want to get rid of. That's why we don't do mergers, like corporation mergers, between denominations anymore. We do full communion. So Lutherans can be uniquely Lutherans, and Presbyterians uniquely Presbyterians, but we're in the same family.
So one of the things that a few folks around here have asked me, and I don't feel like I've done a great job, is that they say, I've always heard that Presbyterians have this belief in predestination, and that there's certain folks that are going to heaven and certain folks that are going to hell.
Yeah.
And you and I both know that that's not necessarily where all Presbyterians fall down at this point, that there's been some changes. How would you say that understanding of predestination that can be read into John Calvin has been worked into current understandings?
So we'll peel the onion back a little bit. So in Western Christianity, the first understanding of predestination comes from Augustine of Hippo, which was bishop in the 300s in North Africa, and wrote The City of God, where he talks about all those that have been baptized are predestined to be in communion with God. That's what that means. Read it at straight value. All that are baptized are predestined to be in communion with God. Now, there's a difference between predestination and predeterminism. And this is where Calvin was starting to trying to figure out, because Calvin and a lot of the other reformers were going back to the early church fathers like Augustine and Cyprian and a bunch of others, trying to figure out what is the core traditions and faiths, what is real and what's not during the time of the Reformation. And so when John Calvin went back to Augustine of Hippo and started reading this concept of predestined, then he was trying to figure out within his context, which was highly volatile. Okay, so you have the Lutherans, you have the Reformed, and you have the Roman Catholics. Then based on the medieval theology he was trying to reconcile, medieval theology said that if you weren't baptized, then you're going to hell. So he was trying to reconcile this concept of hell with what he was reading from the early church fathers and with the Gospels. Predestination means that God wants you here, which is to be in full communion and to be a part of God, but you're over here, and so predestination means that God has pre-desired you to be together. However, we have to exercise our free will and make choices because God is not a tyrant. Can I get an amen on that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So God's going to give us free will. But then as we walk the pilgrim path towards full communion with God, if we go off the path, God's going to come in, like through Jesus Christ, and help us get back on the path because God desires to be at one with us, to be in communion with us. Predeterminism, which a lot of people talk about, and they actually are calling it predestination. Predeterminism means that God has already determined before you were even born who's going to heaven, who's going to hell, and who's redeemed and who's not. When we start looking in that idea of switching between predestination and predeterminism was a political move done by the Dutch for really a lot of reasons. But predeterminism, where this concept that God has already determined that you're going to go to hell before you even were born, then that really makes a God a tyrant. And that really does not match up with what we read in Scripture, especially as the letter of John says that God is love. I mean, can you be a tyrant and love at the same time and do that? So, predestination means that you have free will, you can exercise it however you want, but God wants to have a relationship with you, wants to be at one with you, atonement, at one with you. And whenever you fall off the wagon, God's going to come and find a way to reconcile with you and bring you back in. As the Apostle Paul says, in all things, God will reconcile. And that hopefully means that all of us will meet that destination.
Okay. So there we have a little bit of the distinction that predestination is more that endpoint that's, sort of going in this direction, but the idea of, predetermined, that becomes the sticking point, and we've gotten that, tied in to predestination over the millennia, over the centuries as that's happened.
Usually ecclesiologies or church or theology that wants to control you will use predeterminism versus predestination, which gives you freedom.
Okay. So one of the other distinctions that you touched on, and we've seen over the course of the last year and a half that we've been doing this, is we've brought in folks that are, have bishops. We've, brought in Roman Catholics. We've talked to folks in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and this idea of places where they say, you're going here, you're going there, versus congregational modes where the congregation has full say. And we've talked to the United Church of Christ. We've talked to folks in the Baptist tradition, the National Association of Christian Congregational something or other, NACCC.
Oh yeah.
We've talked with these different groups, but Presbyterians are sort of in a weird situation where there's not the bishops to sort of say, here's that strong central authority, but we're not really congregational. So tell me a little bit more about how the Presbyterian Church USA addresses this idea.
So the Presbyterian tradition, the way of governing via presbyters or elders, is that the Presbyterian tradition is many times called the middle way, meaning that sits right in between the Episcopal model, governance by bishops, and the congregational model, which is governance by the full congregation. Presbyterian tradition is a gradation of courts or levels of the church. One of the first and foremost foundations of Presbyterian polity is that there is one church. There is one church in diaspora, because we all can't meet at the same time in the same place every Sunday. So there are multiple churches spread out through the country, but it is one church broken down into regions and districts and local communities. You could say that the way that the Presbyterian Church is structured, the local congregation is like a city, the presbytery is like a county, the synod is the level of a state, and then there's the national church. But they all have different places of focus of governance of their area, but it is all one church working together. If you did a big Venn diagram, all these things would be overlapping, but they also have their own unique authority and jurisdiction in their particular area. When it comes to the Episcopal side of things, because I'm on for the last 11 years, I've been on the team, the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church USA in dialogue towards full communion. So when we've been pairing up and looking at the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church, we've been trying to look at where do we have commonality and where do we, go separate ways. We actually have more commonality than we do have different things. One of the things that as Presbyterians, which goes all the way back to our mother church, which is the Church of Scotland, hence why I'm wearing blue and collar, because this is the uniform for the Church of Scotland and my ancestors, is that the presbytery, there's no one person that has all complete authority and power. There is no monarchical bishop. What we have, because we do not trust one person holding a lot of power, we make decisions in councils, by groups, by committees, by commissions. And so the presbytery itself, this regional body, is a corporate bishop. So the presbytery is the one who creates pastoral relationships and is also the one that dissolves pastoral relationships. And all pastors that are serving in local congregations, they have accountability to the session, the local church council, as well as the congregation, but ultimately, they are accountable to the presbytery. And so if there's something that's going wrong in the local church, especially in the relationship with the pastor, it's the presbytery that comes in to help mitigate, mediate, and maybe even remove the pastor. And then one of the other things that I think is really unique, as I've come to learn, as I've been talking with other ecumenical partners, is that the Presbyterians, probably because John Calvin was a lawyer, we have a judicial court. We have rules of discipline, so that whenever there is conflict, we have a methodology for mediation, arbitration, and discipline for those that are ordained.
So, as we're thinking about sort of these connections with different levels, with the local congregation and the presbytery, and you talk about the denomination understanding itself as one church that has multiple locations. Tell me a little bit more about how decisions are made in that weird place where there's lots of different views. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is that wherever 2 or 3 Presbyterians are gathered, there's at least 4 opinions.
Yeah.
So how are decisions made in those bodies when we have folks that have very disparate
Right.
views of how the world should work and how church should respond to different situations.
So this goes back to kind of our way of governance, that democratic republic model. So the local congregation nominates individuals to be ordained and installed as presbyters or elders. And that ministry is for oversight and governance of the life of a particular community. So we're starting at the local level. So decisions are made by the presbyters, the elders. And one of the foundational points of our polity is that majority rules. So there will be debate, there will be conflict, there'll be struggle, and it may take, in the decision-making process, may take longer than what a lot of people want. But that's good, because as long as there's conversation and debate, then something can actually happen. So a majority then decides. We prefer a consensus, but majority is the minimum. And so whatever the rule of the elders at the local level, that's what it's going to be. So governance then at the next level, which is the presbytery, which has oversight of the local congregations, it is the local congregations, the elders of the session or the church council of particular congregations that commission elders to go and serve at the presbytery level, or if there's a presbytery committee or something like that that doesn't require a person to be ordained, then the congregation nominates and sends people there. So that the presbytery itself is made up of all the people that it has oversight of. So whenever we say, I know that some people kind of get angry at the presbytery and they'll say, "Oh, that darn presbytery." Well, who is the presbytery? We are. If you're angry at the presbytery, go and talk to your presbytery, your commissioner to presbytery. Go and talk to your pastor. Go and talk to all those other people that are serving at the presbytery level on all these committees and commissions that you're angry with. The only person you're angry with is yourself or your body. But when the elders at the different levels of the church, the local congregation, the presbytery, the synod, and the general assembly, whenever they make decisions, they do so hoping to God that they made the right choice and have been fully informed, and hope that the Holy Spirit is at work. But as the Second Helvetic Confession says, councils can err. So we are in constant discernment, even after a decision is made. But whenever a decision is made, that is the decision because of our form of government.
Until another decision is made that changes it.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, for reformed and always reforming.
Yep. So we've talked about, Presbyterian Church USA, but we also know that there's lots of different Reformed bodies out there. There's the United Church of Christ, there's Reformed Church in America, which is predominantly Dutch Reformed in its background. We've talked about, some Baptists that have some Reformed theological takes on it. There's other Presbyterian church denominations, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Tell me about some of the differences between the PCUSA and other Reformed bodies.
That's interesting. Again, I would say it probably goes down to culture and how those particular bodies came to be. We, as I mentioned, we're part of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, so we relate to a lot of Reformed churches or Presbyterian churches throughout the world, including Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church in England, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the United Church in Canada, and others. But on the American front, a lot of our denominationalism is the culture of the people that settled them. So Presbyterian Church USA, which is the largest body of Presbyterians, we were founded like my ancestors that came over from Scotland and Ulster, Ireland, and planted churches along the eastern seaboard, and also moved into the wild countries and started churches. And then over time, especially because it was really a Scottish church, which is my heritage. Scotsmen, just like a lot of families, they get into arguments, and then they break off. So even before the United States became the United States, there was already Presbyterians came together and then they were breaking apart and over arguments, new light versus old light. Should people, as they go, ministers go into the new frontier, should we require all of them to go back to Princeton, New Jersey, to Princeton Seminary to be educated and then sent back, or can they be educated and mentored on in the front lines in the new world, or the frontier area? So that was an issue. Of the Presbyterian churches that are out there, like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians, all of them are denominations that broke off of the original Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. So we have similar roots, but they chose to break off over particular theological issues, predominantly over the ordination of women as deacons, elders, and ministers, church property, because in the Presbyterian Church USA, as I said, we are one church, so all property is held in trust for the greater body. And then most recently over LGBTQ plus and marriage between same gender people. So those denominations went off and broke up. But before 1983, during the Civil War, that was the first great break, and it was the Presbyterian Church USA in the north and the Presbyterian Church US in the south, and they broke communion with each other over the issue of slavery. And it was from the Civil War and not until 1983 that they finally reconciled and became one church again.
So there have been times where those differences have been overcome and groups have come back together.
Yep.
Great. So tell me about, we've talked about sort of this, connection to other Presbyterian, other Reformed bodies. How does the Presbyterian Church USA relate to other Christian bodies around the world?
So the Presbyterian Church USA has been and always has been ecumenical, meaning that, as our Book of Order says, this is the polity and understanding of a Christian life as we understand it. But it doesn't mean that it's the all in all. It's not. It's not the sandwich in a box of chips. I mean, if we're in conversation with other denominations and other Christians, we're willing to be reformed as we're led to do so. So the Presbyterian Church has always related to other denominations. Even colonial time, Presbyterians were hooking up with the Episcopalians or Anglicans, as well as the Baptists and the Congregationalists. And many of the churches that were on the frontier were jointly established by Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Baptists, Congregationalists, because they felt that at that time, being Christian was more important than their particular cultural identity and tradition. With the ecumenical movement, the Presbyterian Church USA is part of the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, Churches United in Christ, which is actually a unique ecumenical agreement that pulls us into full yet incomplete communion with the historic African American congregations or denominations in the United States. I used to work in the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and my desk was the ecumenical partnerships in Europe and Central Asia. So we would work at the Presbyterian Church USA, which send mission co-workers over to Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and we would work with other denominations and other Christians in those areas around particular things, usually education and health.
Yeah, so one thing that you mentioned that I just want to highlight is that there have been those working relationships, especially between Presbyterian and Congregational folks. So if you go throughout sort of the Northwest Territories, so, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, that area, and you go into a town, you generally will only find either a Presbyterian church or a congregational church
So
because
there was an agreement on
there
it.
was an agreement
Yeah.
so that the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians would send folks out to form new congregations in these newly formed towns. And once the congregation was established, then the congregation would vote, do we want to be Presbyterian or do we want to be congregational? And so that ended up setting up the tone. And quite honestly, most of the smaller towns said, why would we want to be connected with these other congregations that are way back on the East Coast when they have no clue what we're doing? So we're going to just be congregational.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's more congregationalists here in Wisconsin, out in the hinter regions, than there are Presbyterians.
The frontier, yeah.
But when you get into the larger cities, those were places that Presbyterians started. There was a decided, Scottish community that said we're going to be Presbyterian, and then they sent daughter churches in that metropolitan area.
So one of the interesting things I learned about American history as well as world history is that for the British, England, it was a practice during the colonial times for the United States as well as all the way into the 1900s throughout the world, is that whenever they colonized an area, they would actually divide it up and say, okay, so if you're Anglican, this whole section down here will be Anglican churches. This up here will be Congregationalists. This part over here will be Presbyterians. And in fact, that model was carried over even to Puerto Rico, when the United States assumed Puerto Rico, and there was acts of Congress that said, okay, on this island of Puerto Rico, we're going to do like the British and the colonial way. This part around San Juan, it's going to be Presbyterians. Over here, there'll be Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics over here. So in the United States, we did something very similar. They did something very similar with the colonies, so that when you go up into the upper northeast, you'll find a bunch of Congregationalists. And then around Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, you'll find a lot of Scot-Irish Presbyterians. And then there was also these other places where the Anglicans are the most predominant.
Exactly. So we've been talking sort of big picture. We've been talking, what does the denomination look like? What do Presbyterians believe? What are those connections to different churches? But I also find it helpful to take a look at local congregations and understand how that faith is lived out, how that culture shows up. So you're at Southminster Presbyterian Church in Waukesha. Tell me a little bit about ways that the identity for that congregation is developed and fostered there that has a Presbyterian feel to it.
So, Southminster, since its founding back almost 58 years ago on the south side of Waukesha, has lived into that idea of what it means to be Presbyterian, which is basically we're a community, a covenanted community. And leadership is shared. Although it has had a history of a pastor focus, meaning, well, if you need something done, you go and ask the pastor to do it, or you need to have somebody pray for something, well, go and ask the pastor to do it. They have moved away from that, and so the congregation actually practices more pastoral care, which is actually more in line with our Presbyterian identity. But it also has freedom to discern together in groups what is God doing, where is God calling us to act right now in this time in particular place. I think that became very apparent during the pandemic. We had just finished doing a mission stay, so we had a new mission statement, a vision statement. We had core values. We were it. We were the bread and butter pickles. And then we started working on our goals. You know, what are our goals? And then what are our annual objectives to do that, to do these things? Then the pandemic hit, and then that just shifted everything. So the elders with the congregation, as a group, as a community, we were discerning, what is God calling us to do? How is God leading us to utilize technology in new ways that can be reach out beyond just our congregation to, you know, the local community and also the world. And what is it that our community around us in our neighborhood, because part of our mission statement said that we're the hands and feet of Christ in our neighborhood. So if that's true, then what is God calling us to do? So as a congregation and as elders, we discerned that we needed to partner with a group that was a food pantry. So anybody could come when the food pantry was open. We didn't ask for ID. We didn't ask questions. If you needed food, there's food to be had. And that really led us into understanding food insecurity and food justice issues. And that was something that was discerned, all of us together, in prayer and in discussion. And I think that is one of those points of living into being Presbyterians, that we are engaging the world around us, and we're highly mission focused.
So, that sounds wonderful that you guys are working on mission projects that sort of bubble up organically, and that was something that emerged out of the pandemic. We're coming into a totally different, space as congregations now. And so tell me a couple of things that have been going on at Southminster that make you proud to be associated with them. What's some stuff that's happened in the last year that really stands out to you for special, God's kingdom being revealed?
Definitely the thing around food. As we continue to delve into that and talk to people in our neighborhood, and build relationships with our people in the neighborhood. The church has been there for like almost 60 years, and it did not do a good job keeping connection with the neighbors, the people right at its back door. Especially as the south side of Waukesha has changed. So now economically, it is not the highest economic area. It is basically in this little area where it's people earn 50,000 and under. Their highest education may be high school, and there are at least 5 different languages spoken in our area. And Spanish being, well, Waukesha had a large number of Hispanic coming during World War II, so that we have that, but we also have a lot of Eastern,
East Asian?
well, we have East Asian, we have people from Romania and Hungary and
Eastern
Czechoslovakia.
European.
Yeah, Eastern Europeans. So that when we go to the gym, and in the locker room, it used to be I could hear 3 different languages spoken there, but there's definitely 5 in our area. So our congregation engaging the neighborhood has been fantastic. Also, I think as we're coming out of the pandemic and the pulpit supply list, whenever I go on vacation, who's going to preach? So the presbytery usually has a list of ministers that will come to the congregation and preach when I'm on vacation or off on continuing ed or something. Because of the pandemic, that list has shrunk. And so elders and deacons at Southminster have lived into our Presbyterian identity. And when I'm gone, they are preaching, they're leading worship, they're doing all of that. Which has been fantastic and has been a huge spiritual growth on their side.
So Dorothy, you're up for it when I'm gone next? And okay. Okay, we can probably make that arrangement.
I think she just said yes.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Well, great. That really is the list of questions that I have. So we actually have a little bit more time than usual. Christian is, prepared as usual, and so I gave him the questions ahead of time, and so he just pounded through those. So,
Yep.
What questions do you have about the Presbyterian Church USA, Richard? One thing we ask that you repeat the question or paraphrase it so that folks on 966
Okay.
can understand what you're responding to.
So the question is that we have a court or a Supreme Court. Yes, we do. As a stated clerk, which is kind of like a canon lawyer, I would be happy to. The Presbytery has a permanent judicial commission as well as the Synod and the General Assembly. Whenever the General Assembly permanent judicial committee makes a decision on a case, it becomes basically case law or interpretation of the Constitution. I have not been to the most recent debriefing. Is there a particular case that you're thinking of?
Richard is one that is just interested in sort of like, well, you talked about these courts, so tell me about a recent decision. So something from previous time would be fun. Just examples of what are kinds of cases that
Yeah.
the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission hears and decides on.
So part of the issue for me right now is that I'm also on the General Assembly's Advisory Committee on the Constitution. So they keep us in the dark until a decision is made on particular issues. But one of the most recent things that that was discussed at a GA Permanent Judicial Commission was who is responsible for if a pastor is removed. Who is responsible for the compensation package of the pastor? Does the congregation have to pay it? And can a presbytery mandate a congregation to pay a compensation package for a pastor that's been released? And so the case came out, which was very convoluted, to basically say that as long as a congregation is chartered and a congregation has voted on a particular compensation for a pastor, the presbytery, all they can do is make sure that it meets the minimum standard requirements. So that has really changed up some ideas and some thoughts.
So don't know if that raises any other questions for you, Richard, but it gives you an idea of some of the boring stuff that the General Assembly
Yeah.
Permanent Judicial Commission has to deal with.
Oh, yeah. So going all the way back, I mean, life in the Presbyterian Church has gotten a lot more quiet and boring. Back in the day, there was a question: if a presbytery ordains an open LGBTQ person to be a minister of word and sacrament, during that time, it was contrary to the Constitution. Can that ordination be revoked? And the General Assembly said no, because once somebody is ordained, they are always ordained. Now, if they can hold membership in a particular presbytery, that's another question, but they are ordained, and you can't take back that ordination. As for marriages, with the current, the Directory for Worship part of our Constitution was just recently changed, like 4 or 5 years ago.
Something.
Pandemic time has screwed me up. And the way that it reads now is that marriage is traditionally between a man and a woman, but that is not the full definition of marriage. So if the civil law allows for same-gender marriage, then a minister of the Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA may preside at a wedding. If it is on a campus of a church of the Presbyterian Church USA, the session, like all other marriages, has to also approve that application for the marriage to happen on those grounds. But there's nothing that will force a minister nor a session to allow it to happen.
And just following up, one of the things that happens with the way that permanent judicial commissions work is that we generally don't have, far-ranging policy discussions. Usually they're fairly narrow in the interpretation. So we aren't having the Supreme Court make huge decisions that switch a pendulum this way or that way. Generally, those things would go back to the General Assembly, which is sort of that legislative body that meets every other year at this point to say, here's what this means, or change the language.
Yeah, and it is possible for a permanent judicial commission to have one of its decisions um, brought to the General Assembly for evaluation or reconsideration, because a commission has just been empowered by the main council of authority. And so the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission receives its jurisdiction from the General Assembly. So if a permanent judicial commission rules a particular way, there is one last Hail Mary way in which to have it turned over, and that's by bringing it to the full General Assembly for consideration or reconsideration. And if that happens, then that's where my committee, the Advisory Committee on the Constitution, comes in, and it's law. I mean, there's a narrow gate by which we evaluate and we determine based on case law and history. And our case law goes all the way back to 1789.
Art?
Have you ever had any congregations excommunicated?
Not lately.
So,
No, that's, I
so
mean,
the question was, have you ever
sorry.
had any congregations excommunicated?
and if you have, for what reason? So, back in the day, there was excommunication going left and right. If you've ever been to Vernon or Big Bend, Wisconsin, which is the south of Waukesha, you'll find over there by the McDonald's, right before you get onto the freeway, two Presbyterian churches. One that was part of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, and then just down the road, the Vernon Presbyterian Church, which right now is in the midst of dissolution. So the Reformed Presbyterian congregation were highly pietistic. And basically, if you went bowling on Saturday night and the elders heard about it, then you would be excommunicated the next Sunday. And then they would just walk across the field and join Vernon Presbyterian Church. That's the history of those two congregations. In the history of the Presbyterian Church USA, even going back into the time of the frontier, the only time that I know of that was of significance of the denomination excommunicating was in the creation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and which is also where part of my family was members of. And the General Assembly excommunicated a whole presbytery in Kentucky, Transylvania Presbytery, because they wanted to train their pastors on the frontier. And they had some issues. They were mixing with the Methodists, so they were starting to have more of a universal sense of salvation, and called Arminianism. And so the whole presbytery was excommunicated, which then created a whole new denomination. So that's the only last time I know of Presbyterian churches being excommunicated.
Now, there are congregations where the presbytery will say how you're acting is not okay, and the presbytery can actually make action to take control over that congregation. There's also times that congregations say, we don't agree with where you're going as a denomination, and we want to depart the denomination. So there is some movement there, but because it's not congregationally based, like the Missouri Synod Lutherans or the Congregationalists, then there's a little bit more back and forth and interplay there.
Yeah, usually there is hopefully a respectful divorce in some ways. Like if a congregation wants to depart for another Reformed church or another denomination, we have process for that. If a minister of Word and Sacrament decides that they no longer can adhere to the confessions of faith of the Presbyterian Church USA, then we will help them land well within another denomination where they are more welcomed or feel more themselves.
So Edna and then Ellie.
Dr. McClure of the Free Presbyterian Church. So when I hear Free Presbyterian Church, that is usually in connotation with England. And the Free Presbyterians over there broke off of the Church of Scotland because the Church of Scotland was a state church. And Free Presbyterian means that they do not recognize themselves as part of the state church. So they have more freedom.
Okay, Ellie?
Oh, yeah. See, so I used to be on the board of Presbyterian Homes. And I was on the board when Dixon Hollow was being discerned and the plans were being brought out. And so Dixon Hollow is part of Presbyterian Homes and Services, and it is a corporation, non-for-profit corporation that is in covenant relationship with the Presbyterian Church USA. And so a lot of people that are on the board are also part of the Presbyterian Church, either ministers or our Presbyterian exec, or when I was serving, I was there as the state clerk for our denomination. And so when the Brookfield Church was discerning what their next steps were, where God was calling them, and Dixon Hollow was happening at the same time, they decided maybe this is a good conversation to have, because there are other Presbyterian home and service associations throughout the United States. This is just the Wisconsin, Minnesota region. And we do have other congregations that are part of the other retirement communities. So, and in fact, in St. Louis, where I was before I came here, the Presbyterian Homes and Services and the Episcopal Church's homes and services are one body. They merge together. So it's Presbyterian and Episcopal Homes and Services. And they have congregations that are part of the community. And even in Louisville, Kentucky, the Mutual Presbyterian sold their building and became just like Brookfield Church did here. So it's not uncommon, and it's probably going to become more prevalent in the future.
So, and one of the things that helped was that a member of Brookfield Presbyterian Church was on the board of Presbyterian Homes, and that
Yeah.
helped to facilitate the conversation. But the Presbyterian Homes and Services is related to the Presbyterian Church USA, but it's a totally separate entity. There's just sort of a covenantal relationship. It's sort of like Carroll University. Carroll University was founded by Presbyterians. It's not, controlled by the denomination, but it recognizes there's a connection there.
Yeah, and it advertises and carries forward that Presbyterian identity, although it's not enforced.
Yeah.
Because it has to do with property, the greater church also was involved.
Because, again, if you go back to the understanding that this is one church in multiple locations, property is held in trust. So anything that a local congregation owns is there used with the idea that this belongs to the broader church as well. Anytime property is bought or sold or mortgaged, there has to be that buy-in from the larger group, so the presbytery, because the presbytery is actually on the hook if a default happens on a loan, and if a congregation closes, the property and the care of the property goes back to the presbytery. So we talked about Vernon Church down in Big Bend, that closing. That actually is now the responsibility of the presbytery to make sure that the bills are paid, the lights are on, the snow is plowed, and that actually there's a daycare facility using the building, and that the work of that goes on. And so we have groups of folks from the presbytery working on that.
So kind of tangent to that, whenever a existing congregation, as long as they don't dissolve, If a congregation, with the permission of the presbytery, sells its property and it goes off and does something different, like rents space someplace, as long as they remain a chartered church, they get to keep all of the income from that sale of that property.
And that's actually what happened with Brookfield Presbyterian, that when Brookfield moved in here, they sold the property that was on Brookfield Road south of Gebhard, and then they had the money. But we also invested
Hmm.
almost $500,000 into this as a leasehold. So Brookfield Presbyterian put in significant money to make this space much larger and give us the office space that Presbyterian homes normally wouldn't build onto here. And so so Living Hope Presbyterian Church has a legal document that says we have this much money invested in it, and it depreciates every year until the point that we end up not having that money. But if we ever close, if we end up moving out, we get some of that money back that goes to the congregation if it moves, or back to the presbytery if before that contracted time is up. Bert, did I see your hand?
Do you ordain women? And your presbytery? Do you have women pastors?
Oh, the question is, do we have women pastors? Yes, we do. We have a lot of women pastors. In fact, when we look at the statistics of the denomination, it was at one point 50-50. Now there are more women probably than those that identify as male.
And actually, I sleep with one of those because I'm married to one. My
Yeah.
wife is also an ordained minister of the
Right.
Presbyterian Church in the Presbyterian of
Yeah.
Milwaukee. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Julie Peterson, who was the previous pastor here, was also a woman. So she was actually instrumental in this move. Ellie?
Yeah, so the question is about the carrying place, which was in the lower level or the basement of First Presbyterian of Waukesha. So during the pandemic, the carrying place was a victim of the circumstance. And also the congregation itself in its discernment of its vitality. So eventually, as we emerged from the pandemic and they were looking at the congregation and the elders, the session was trying to figure out what the future was. Did they dissolve or do they go forward in a different way? First Presbyterian of Waukesha decided that it would sell its building. And so, since the carrying place was a leaser of the bottom part, well, the lease was no longer in need because they no longer were there. So, First Presbyterian sold their building to Waukesha City Church, which has ties with the Swedish Baptists. That's not what they're called anymore, but it is the Swedish Baptists. And First Presbyterian Waukesha moved in with the Episcopalians across the street. So they're nesting. They are being pastored by the priest at St. Matthias Episcopal Church, and they are there discerning what their future will be. Oh, it was, yes,
And
yeah.
and sometimes that's what happens is, and I don't know whether the carrying place was this or not, but sometimes congregations start a particular ministry that grows and gets to the point that it's more than what the congregation can handle, and so the congregation sort of spins it off to its own nonprofit status, and then it provides support along the way as they're able to. I don't know if the carrying place was like that or if it just found the space.
They found the space, and they worked
So-
together as partners for a very long time.
But that kind of partnership is something that Presbyterian congregations hopefully are doing a lot. Um, We might have time for one more question. Well, if not, so friends, we are going to be taking a short break on this until the end of April, just because the first Thursday in April is Maundy Thursday, so we won't do it then. And then we have some scheduling issues, so I'm not exactly sure the exact date yet for the next two times for our faith conversations, but it will be with the Hindu Temple of Wisconsin.
Oh,
And so we'll be talking about Hinduism. The first time we'll talk about what do Hindus believe, and the second time we'll talk about how does that faith get practiced. So what does it look like to be Hindu? So let's take a moment to give thanks to Christian for his time. And I will see you hopefully on Sunday, and we will be picking this back up at the end of April. Thanks, friends.